Soul Night Live, number 17. Thank you all for coming by tonight. Tonight, our guest is Laurence Juber, who played with Paul McCartney's Wings. You might remember him from the late 70s lineup that did this fantastic album called Back to the Egg. Here we go. Laurence will be joining us in about 15 minutes as soon as I finish my little monologue here and round up my co-host tonight, Mr. Fernando Perdomo. So stick around, make yourself comfortable. We're going to talk all about Laurence's time with Paul and his fantastic session career before and after, and a lot of other cool stuff. So you won't want to miss this one. So make yourself comfortable, and we'll get things rolling here in just a minute. Alrighty. All right. Well, thanks. Again, this is Soul Night Live number 17. Tonight, our guest is Laurence Juber from Paul McCartney's Wings.
Yep.
And he's also a great session musician and an amazing fingerstyle guitarist that's played exclusively in the Dadgad Tuning for the past 20 years at least. So we're going to find out what that's all about now. So
yeah, it's very interesting. Guys like Robert Fripp and that stuck to that new standard tuning. You know, the whole concept of tunings, like in the Joni Mitchell sense, was to have variety. So it's interesting to have some guy, you know, stick to one tuning. So yeah, I'm interested in seeing what happens.
I'm very interested. All right, without further ado, good evening. This is Laurence Juber. Hi, Laurence.
Hi, Laurence.
Hello.
Good evening. Thanks for your patience while I preambled.
Are you hearing me okay?
Yeah, yes. There you are.
Yeah, I could hear you fine.
Good, good. So I was just doing some practice while I was waiting.
Oh, that's the way to do it.
Yeah, there was some competition. There's a film composers, some kind of deal. Where is it? Los Angeles Film Conducting Intensive New Music Project, where they had composers compete to write various instrumental pieces. And I volunteered to be the guitar guinea pig. So they sent me 3 pieces, and I've been trying to figure out which one is the primo one.
Okay.
Nice.
Very interesting. Well, I was wondering what you've been up to lately. How have you been spending your days during this unusual time?
Yeah, other than doing a Facebook live concert 3 times a week.
I've seen it. I love it. I love it.
Well, there's a lot going on. I mean, doing those concerts because I'm digging deep into old repertoire. Not only wing stuff. You know, occasionally I'll do a show that's all Wings, and I did one show that was all Back to the Egg.
Wow.
Just me alone. So that was a challenge.
That's cool.
It was fun. But just digging into old repertoire takes time. Doing new arrangements, and some of them very spontaneous. I mean, this is my space. This is my studio, and I get to be creative as much as I want right now because there's no traveling to do. And the Facebook Live at least gives me an opportunity to perform, even though it's different from playing in front of a live audience, which is, there's a thing, there's a chemistry that happens when you've got a live audience. But with Facebook, at least I can see comments, and there's a feeling that there are people out there. So it's a different experience. It's more like doing TV, really, as opposed to a live performance. So there's that going on, and I'm kind of, even though there's no point in really releasing CDs right now, I've got enough tunes for the next album, so that's kind of percolating. And then my wife Hope and I we wrote the score for the Brady Bunch musical, the Very Brady musical, which was supposed to get a tour starting later this year, but that's been pushed off till next year. So we've been doing demos for that and just kind of refining that. but unlike, normally I'd bring singers into the studio, and now I'm just having to send MP3s out, and they're sending me
Yeah.
back, so.
Are you in LA, that
Yeah.
area? Okay. Okay. So it's not.
No, I mean, it's a creative environment, and, we get to walk the dogs 3 times a day, and the grandkids come over and jump in the pool, and, there's a lot going on. But to be able to completely focus on music is actually kind of refreshing.
Yeah, I found that with most of the people I've interviewed so far. I started doing this show once COVID started in March, I guess, because, I had a lot of things lined up with my own band, but suddenly they all went down the drain. So I thought, well, we could at least talk about music if we can't all play it together. And this has kind of turned into a thing. So I'm really glad to have you be part of it. You're one of the first people I thought of.
Well, happy to be part of a thing.
Yes, it's growing, a snowballing thing. I like it when that happens. So, well, I thought maybe we'd start kind of at the beginning in a way and kind of work forward. One of the things we do on this show is we talk about early musical memories. And I was wondering, what are some of yours, like songs that maybe you heard around the house that you fell in love with that your parents played, or maybe siblings? What are some early musical loves?
We had a record player, turntable. One of those, just portable one. And I only remember us having one record, which was The Happy Wanderer.
Happy Wanderer.
Go wandering, it's like, some German folk song. That's the only one I remember, which is odd because my dad was a fan of big bands. But, the radio was on a lot in our house. So I heard a lot of music on the radio. But the stuff that, I first really kind of connected with was I had an older cousin who, when I guess I was probably about 8, played me. So that would have been kind of, 7, 8 years old, been late 50s, 59 maybe. Played me Buddy Holly and Elvis. And that was really kind of a musical awakening for me. And then, of course, you had Cliff Richard and the Shadows. So Patchy was a big deal.
Sure.
There's all that twangy guitar stuff.
Love that.
Really cool.
Yeah.
And beyond that, there was stuff in the air. And of course, on the radio, I would listen not only to the BBC, which was incredibly eclectic. I mean, you would hear anything from light classical to big band to rock and roll, all in the same program.
Yeah.
I mean, we didn't have the kind of stratified radio program like you did in America. But there was Radio Luxembourg, which broadcast from Europe, and they would play stuff that was American Top 40. So I heard Motown. I remember hearing like Carole King, It Might As Well Rain Until September and stuff like that. So we're getting into that kind of 62, 63 period. I remember hearing the Beatles on the radio for the first time with Love Me Do, which didn't make that much of an impression, but Please Please Me did. So 1963 became kind of the year of, oh my God, what's going on here? You have this building wave of Beatlemania, which didn't let up. So by November of 63, in August, you had She Loves You came out, which was, that was kind of, okay, I want to stop buying these singles. And that really, then, the Beatles did the Command performance, the Rattle Your Jewelry.
Right.
And that was just a week before my 11th birthday, and I got a guitar on my birthday, and I just never put it down.
Cool.
I was about to ask if that whole thing inspired you to want a guitar right away.
Oh, I really wanted a guitar, but my dad wanted me to play the saxophone. So what I did was I said, okay, I'll learn the clarinet in school, but I made sure my name was at the bottom of the list.
Nice.
I ran out of clarinets before they ever got to me, and then the Beatles becoming kind of quite legit made the guitar less of a hooligan instrument and something more kind of acceptable. And I got this really inexpensive kind of East European guitar with a bolt-on neck.
Hmm.
But like the bolt was on the outside. I mean,
Uh,
what I didn't know at the time, because the action was really high. So what I used to do was get like cardboard, like from a cornflakes packet, and stuff it underneath the floating fingerboard. The fingerboard wasn't attached to the top; it was kind of floating. So
wow.
stuff that underneath there, which made the action more playable. And of course, all the black stuff would come off on, it's just black paint on the fingerboard. But what I didn't know until relatively recently was that style of neck joint. Actually, there's a key, and if you put the key in there, you can action. It's
Ah,
something that actually goes back to like early 19th century Vienna. Maker named Stauffer used that mechanism. And Stauffer, one of the key people that worked in Stauffer's factory was C.F. Martin. So when Martin came to America and started building Martin guitars, he actually built guitars with that key neck mechanism. But
That's so cool.
it's an old Northern European kind of way of attaching the neck. Very unspanish.
Wow.
Yeah.
do you still have that guitar?
No, I have no idea what happened to it.
Oh, okay. Well, so what was your
Maybe 2 or 3 guitars from my teen years that somehow, I think one of them ended up in France because I gave it to a friend of mine, and that was the last I saw of it. And there was, I think one was in my mom's attic, and I just don't know what happened when she moved, and she came over to America eventually. So certain things, it's like somewhere, probably in a dumpster somewhere, there are tapes, reel-to-reel tapes of songs that I wrote when I was 15, which I remember
Cool.
not a note of.
Hmm.
But it was like really clear to me as I progressed into being a teenager that I wanted to be a professional guitar player. That to me, that was the way that I wanted to make a living.
what
And
was
so that became my ambition.
what was your first really good guitar that you had? Like,
You mean as opposed to a perfectly good guitar?
well, beginner versus pro, I guess.
Well, my first good pro guitar was a 63 Stratocaster,
Wow.
Nice. Yes.
which I basically bought with my bar mitzvah money. I mean, I'd
Nice.
saved it up, and that went into the West End of London and found the Stratocaster, this kind of sonic blue Strat. I didn't know at the time that was kind of what the Beatles were using for Rubber Soul.
Mhm.
Yeah. Nowhere Bad and things like that.
Yeah.
But
The famous Rocky.
but my problem was that I could only afford one good guitar, and I was getting into playing a lot of jazz, and I had kind of a cheap Japanese 335 kind of knockoff that actually sounded pretty good playing blues through a Watkins Dominator. So I kind of stuck with that as my main electric. And then I had an Epiphone Triumph arch top that I had a Bill Lawrence pickup on. And that was kind of more the jazz guitar.
Okay.
I mean, then later, when I got into college and I needed a Les Paul, I got a Les Paul and another
Mhm.
Strat. And those were stolen, I think, 1976.
Ah, worst.
Central London. And
Now, when you mentioned that you were interested in getting into being a guitar player, a lot of the other people, when they saw the Beatles, they said, I want to join a band. You wanted to be a guitar player. Did you ever have an interest in being
I
a
mean,
rock star?
well, not so much being a rock star. I enjoy playing in bands. I mean, the closest I got, I think I wanted to be kind of, like a blues rock lead guitar player. Because that was a means of self-expression, and finally ended up doing that for Paul McCartney. So there was an arc to that. But at the same time, I was really fascinated by the self-sufficiency of folk guitar players, especially players that could play like ragtime and finger picking and stuff like that. Like in England, we had Pentangle,
Burt Jenks.
Graham, and
Yeah.
they were a great inspiration for me. because I just liked that kind of approach. And I used to, play at folk clubs. I had a duo with a friend of mine, and we opened for like Martin Carthy and Al Stewart and people. And it was funny, because years later I ended up producing 4 albums for Al Stewart. But I was 14. I was his opening act.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's pretty amazing. I believe Al Stewart was a neighbor of Robert Fripp's, and Robert Fripp gave him like his.
From Bournemouth, as was Andy Summers.
Yeah, I thought so. Yeah, that's
Um,
must be something in the water there.
I read that Robert Fripp was giving Al Stewart guitar lessons, and Robert Fripp said Al Stewart didn't do anything I taught him, therefore he was successful.
Well, Al really kind of is representative of that kind of crossover folk pop rock singer-songwriter. And, there's a big fan base for his early stuff, the pre-Year of the Cat stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Like not Time Passages, Past, Present, and Future, and, the Nostradamus and Rose to Moscow, and the stuff that was getting played on college radio in the kind of 73, 74.
Again, it was glorious that labels were giving artists 5 or 6 albums to grow before they blew up. These days, you get 1 single and then you're done.
And there was plenty of that going on too. Back in the, when I started getting into producing the odd record, when I was in Wings, I found that, it was like one occasion they said, okay, here's a band, you're going to see them the night before you go in the studio, and you've got £1,000 to make a single. It was really kind of very limited. Whereas, on the major label level, I remember, Chris Thomas spent some time working with the Pretenders, because he did that, the Pretenders album was right after Back to the Egg.
Mm-hmm.
So he did, basically the Sex Pistols, Wings, and then the Pretenders all in a row.
Ah,
Wow, that's quite.
that would be an interesting concert, Bill.
That's true. That wasn't the career that I aspired to. I'd always enjoyed being a studio musician, because that was really out of college. I went to London University and I studied music. I didn't study guitar. I took some classical guitar lessons, because I needed to have a certain grade level on classical guitar in order to be able to study music.
Mm-hmm.
But I had discovered really as a teenager that not only was it guitar that fascinated me, but it was also the way the records were put together. And so I would listen to records, listen to the radio, and figure out what the drums were doing, what the bass was doing, how the guitar parts kind of fitted in. I didn't know it at the time, but I just, I was an arranger. It wasn't until way later that I really started to use that skill set. Same thing with composing. I never really got into composing until much later, because my passion and my ambition was to just be in the studio making records and all that stuff.
It's an art form. It's a beautiful art form.
Yeah, it is. It's, but LA had the Wrecking Crew, London had its own version of it.
Which was one of the questions I wanted to ask, because you got started, one of the first big records you played on was Tales of Mystery and Imagination by Alan Parsons, and those records seem to have a revolving cast of what I would consider London's Wrecking Crew, guys like David Payton and Stuart Elliott, and then you were involved with that whole scene, playing on all the records. So,
the funny thing was, I didn't know that I played on that album.
Wow,
Really?
I read it in a magazine like 25 years later.
Isn't that fun?
With Alan Parsons, he said, yeah, and we had Laurence Juber come in and play guitar. We did. And when the album came out, my name wasn't on the credits, but when the CD release came out, it was. And
that's fascinating.
It was a session at Abbey Road Studio 2 on a Tuesday night with a string orchestra of Francis Monkman on harpsichord and a couple of
there.
It was not, and of course at Abbey Road in that studio, you never went up into the control room.
Studio 2?
Studio 2, yeah.
I recorded there. It was incredible.
There was when I was working there in April of '78, and I got a phone call which was really unusual to get a phone call at the studio. The only time that ever had happened before was when my father died. I mean, it was literally like when the phone, when you get a phone call, it's like, oh, geez, what's going on? And I finally went up the stairs into the control room, and it was McCartney's office wanting to know if I could be available to come and jam with Denny on Monday, which happened.
Wow. So there was no cattle calling. There was no cattle call guitar audition.
No, but what had happened was, I'd kind of got established as a studio player. And I was playing on a lot of stuff. I mean, one of the first sessions I played on was for a Cleo Lane record that was being produced by George Martin.
Wow.
And that was a fascinating experience for me because I'd really barely worked with any record producers before. And here I am working with the Beatles record producer.
Yeah, the guy, yeah.
And I was, pretty green at the time. So I appreciated his patience and his encouragement. But it very quickly kind of developed to the point where I was working, 7 days a week, doing 2, 3, sometimes 4 sessions a day. Start off 8 o'clock at Trident with a jingle session, and then go to Olympic from 10 till 1, and then to Abbey Road from 2 till 5, and then something at the BBC in the evening. I mean, it would be, wouldn't be unusual.
May I ask what your favorite studio was?
Well, Abbey Road, I think, but only because I spent so much time there with Wings.
Yes.
Olympic was pretty cool. But
I mean, those studios are the soundtrack of my life. When I think about all the records that were done there, and they each had their own vibe. And it's interesting that you worked in all of them.
I did. I worked in a lot of them. But, but the measure of it for me was what the parking was like. I've got like 6 guitars, an amp, and a briefcase full of pedals, and I had to run from let's say Olympic, which is west side of London, into to Trident, which is the West End, with like no parking. I mean, and it's in an alleyway, so you got to kind of schlep everything into the studio, with your blinkers on, hoping you don't get a ticket. Then go park, then go set up. I mean, it was, I was always
I've been there.
It was just like a full day in the one studio, because then, but then those full days could turn into a full night as well.
Yeah.
Especially on some of the French disco sessions.
Well, that's awesome. And what was your usual go-to situation? I mean, one of the things that has changed a lot in the studio industry is a lot of the places have a whole array of amplifiers you could use. One of the things I noticed about Abbey Road is that they actually don't have a lot of amplifiers. And back in the 70s, did you have to bring everything, or did you?
Yeah, the studios didn't have amps. I was shocked when I got to New York, and I had a very heavy but very small Mesa Boogie amp, and I would, I started schlepping it, in a taxi to go to sessions, and I'd show up at the studio, and all the studios had amps. They had like these tweed fenders and stuff, and it was like, okay, don't need that. So no, you had to bring the gear, where, I mean, like here I've got a whole array of amps, and half the time I end up using a plug-in anyway.
Yeah.
But in the course of being a session player, I worked with a lot of people, played on a lot of records, and not much in the way of movies. I think I played on a Carry On movie one time, except for The Spy Who Loved Me, which was a big deal, and very little TV as well. I just wasn't in that kind of that particular circle of those kinds of sessions. I was just doing mostly it was records and jingles. But then I was working on a TV show in the house band for David Essex.
Oh, wow.
Which went on the air in September of '77. And each week there would be a guest, like a musical guest, and there was Twiggy came on. In fact, there's a version on YouTube, there's a version of David Essex and Twiggy doing Send in the Clowns.
Oh, cool.
Very prominent acoustic guitar, which was me.
Awesome.
And then we had Ronnie Spector was a guest. That was when she had a single out in England. was it Say Goodbye to Hollywood or something like that.
Oh, cool.
And then we had Denny Lane, and Denny did Go Now. And for some reason, they decided not to give him a piano solo, but to give the solo to the guitar. And I was playing the guitar. And Denny liked what I did. And apparently he called Richard Niles a few days later, who was the musical director for the show. And he said, is he versatile? And Richard, assured Denny that I was. And then a few months later, I ran into him and Linda and Paul at Air Studios. Because I was early for a session and they were running late. They were doing, I think it was like the Oriental Nightfish or one of those animations they were mixing. And that was when Denny introduced me to Paul and Linda. But there was still kind of no real discussion of, I knew that they were looking for a guitar player, but I was just so busy that it wasn't something that I was going to pursue. And then in March of 78, my dad passed away suddenly. And a month later was when I was working at Abbey Road and got the call to go and audition. And I didn't really know any Wings tunes.
Oh.
I borrowed
Had you ever seen Wings?
Only on telly.
Wow.
I'd seen the previous week, I'd been working on a TV show, and I think it was called Get Together, that was done in Manchester. And during the course of the show, they would have like live acts, but they would also show videos. And they showed the video of With a Little Luck. It was either With a Little Luck or London Town, I forget which one. But Steve Holly was playing drums in the video.
I remember the video.
And somebody in the band said, they're still looking for a guitar player. And then it was within a couple of weeks that I got, might have even been within a week that I got the call.
What did you guys jam on that first day?
Oh, like some Chuck Berry tunes and some reggae.
Okay.
And then Paul says, what are you doing for the next few years? I had to think about it deeply for a nanosecond, because I had really worked so hard to establish my career as a studio player, but I wasn't going to turn down the opportunity to work with Paul McCartney. So
that's great.
Ultimately, I think I fit the suit. The Brady Bunch reference.
That's nice. Now, I have a question. So, this was the amazing world of playing, large arenas and stadiums and touring and girls and screaming and all that stuff. Did you have any touring experience before this?
Not really, only playing around England with different ensembles, whether it was the National Youth Jazz Orchestra was really kind of my first touring experience. We used to get on a bus and drive around. And then I played with some commercial society type bands for a while I was in college and right after. And for a while I played with, are you familiar with The Goon Show?
I know that.
Well, on The Goon Show, there was one of the musical acts was a guy named Ray Ellington, who did some really cool kind of bebop influenced kind of semi-novelty stuff. And I ended up getting his gig, which was really a challenge because it was a lot of sight reading and it was very kind of complex jazzy stuff. And I did some touring with him. And I also was in a band for a little while with Pete Brown, the lyricist,
Wow. Yeah, Cream.
He had a band called Back to the Front. He had a band originally called Pliblocto or something, and then it was Back to the Front. But that was, didn't last very long. And then for a while I played with a band called Landscape, who had a hit or two in the 80s, but they never replaced me. They went on without guitar.
Interesting.
But I hadn't done anything on, the McCartney level, but nor did I for the first year. I mean, we really spent, from May of 78 through, pretty much through to April of, 78 through April of 79. We spent in the studio.
And was the music already written in advance, or did you kind of work on it together in the studio as it
Oh
went
no, we
along?
worked on it. I mean, songs were mostly written, um, but it's like session work. Somebody comes in with a song, and you come up with parts,
Hmm.
Sure,
and just kind of massage it until it turns into a record.
sure. That's it.
Wow.
That's so
That's
cool.
so cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, totally.
So tell us a bit more about that first year. Was it just something where you just met at the studio, or were there like a rehearsal place that you also practiced in?
No, I mean, we didn't rehearse much outside of, not at that point, we didn't rehearse outside of the studio, except where the first thing that we did, actually the very first session we did was for a song called Same Time Next Year. That wasn't released until like 10 years later. But it was done as a demo for a movie of the same name, and Paul ended up not getting the score. I think Marvin Hamlish got it,
Uh,
who I had worked with on the Spy Who Loved Me soundtrack. Um, but um, but we did this demo, which was I mean, it was like a kind of My Love type song, and they put like a 60-piece string orchestra on it, and it was like the most produced demo that I'd ever played on. But of course, when you're doing stuff for a Hollywood movie, you've got to make it, you've got to make it grand.
Yeah,
mhm.
exactly.
But that was the first session we did, and then we went up to Scotland for like 3 weeks, and just spent some time jamming and kind of playing around with ideas for some of these songs. And some of the songs were developed in that rehearsal process. And then we ended up doing the video for I've Had Enough, which was the next single from London Town.
Mhm.
So Steve and I are in that video, even though we're not on the record. And we played it live later, but and that was the end of May, and then we went not long after. We went to New York for a bit to take care of business, and then we came back and went back up to Scotland to actually start seriously recording.
So tell us a bit more about that first year. What what songs kind of grew out of that particular? Like pretty much everything on the album,
Yeah,
or
everything on the album was on the agenda. Um, we recorded, I covered all this stuff in my book, Guitar with Wings, with a lot of the photos that I
yeah, I
took.
wanted to ask about that.
And so the narrative is there, but basically, I mean, the first thing we recorded was To You, which
Oh yeah,
was, really left field and quite out there. And we very rapidly went into Spin It On and Old Siam's. We did Love Awake. Um, did we do Love Awake? No, Winter Rose. We did Winter Rose and we demoed Love Awake. Um, and then we also spent a day in Scotland doing all the Rupert demos, Rupert the Bear stuff. Um, and Arrow Through Me got done in that first group too. Um, and again and again and again was done. And then we took August off and then went back. We went into the castle in September, and that was where we did Getting Closer and Love Away. Um, and a lot of other, a bunch of other stuff. Um, hard to remember all the tunes now. And of course, we demoed Rockestra because we were going to go into Abbey Road. We went into Abbey Road in early October. We recorded Rockestra there, and then we continued to work. We did Baby's Request at Abbey Road. And one of the tunes that didn't make the album that we had worked on was Cage, which is kind of one of the outtakes. And then when we were in Scotland, we also did Maisie, which was my tune, which was like finger-picking instrumental piece. So, it was, I mean, there was a strong work ethic going on, but of course, when you start getting into doing backing vocals, you can spend all day on a chorus. I mean, so it's not always exciting. It's not always scintillating studio stuff, but I went from a tune an hour, which is your typical kind of studio session, to a tune every a day or every few days. So it was a different thing. But I started learning about engineering and production and taking advantage of the time to kind of fill in my education. That's why I like to think of it as my master's in music from McCartney University.
So how did it go?
I learned a lot from him about business too. So yeah, you were saying, I'm sorry.
No, that's fine. So how did it go? Did you finish the album and then you go on tour and then you did some other things after that? I'm wondering kind of where Good Night Tonight and Coming Up slots in.
What happened then was Good Night Tonight was around because Paul had started working on it before I joined the band.
Wow.
And it was kind of, we had listened to it and then it kind of just got put on the shelf. And then in January of '79, we knew that we needed a single before the album was going to come out. So there was a meeting and, it was, we all remember it differently. Steve Holly remembers it being a competition. I don't. I remember that, the discussion was, what did the Beatles do when they needed a new single? And Paul said, we'd write one over the weekend. And so it was like, we'll go write one over the weekend. And he came in on Monday morning with Daytime, Nighttime Suffering. Now, at that point, we were in the basement of his office in Soho Square in central London, which is not a studio, but we had turned it into a replica of the control room of Abbey Road Studio 2. So it was kind of laid out the same way. There was a big picture window with, a photograph of the studio with a little working clock in the middle. And it was kind of, we had the gear, we had the equipment from Abbey Road, and we had the echo chambers were coming in over the phone lines, high-res phone lines. And we were all set up to be mixing the album. And then Paul walks in and says, I want to cut this track. Now, so the drums are set up in a little kitchenette area. It was really like a home studio setup, which Paul had no issue with because that's how he recorded McCartney, and McCartney too, for that matter. That's how we were set up, was in this very, very small space. And we cut the track on the Monday and then worked on it during the week. And at the same time, we knew we needed a B-side, and he had Good Night Tonight. So we worked on that, and it ended up, they got flipped, and Good Night Tonight became the A-side.
Wow.
That's one of my favorite Wings tunes. I think it's so catchy. Can you tell us a bit about your acoustic work on that? It's almost has a bit of a flamenco quality to it. What was your inspiration?
Basically what they said was, let's have some acoustic guitar right there. There was like, a space for it. And I said, I don't have an acoustic with me, so I borrowed Denny's. We both had kind of matching Ovation Adamus guitars, so it was kind of felt familiar. And so they ran the track, and I just kind of fired off some licks. And I said, you mean like that kind of thing? They said, yeah, exactly that. And that was it. It was like one take.
Yeah. And I love the back and forth electric solo too.
Oh yeah, that's fun. Yeah, I mean there's Paul, Denny, and myself, but that was all kind of layered. It wasn't the three of us in one room at the same time.
And Denny had that Travis Bean guitar.
But just to digress for a second, one take solos that I wasn't there for this, but Denny says that on Listen to What the Man Said, Tom Scott's soprano sax on that was played with one hand while he was writing down the chords. It was like the first time he heard it, and he's playing along, and they had it in record, and he said, okay, I'm ready to take it, and they said, oh, we got it now. That was one.
That's amazing.
Yeah, wow, that's who would have guessed. And it's such a great solo.
But to expand on the Tom Scott aspect, this studio that I'm in fact, the back room over there, was Tom Scott grew up in this house, and his dad, Nathan Scott, was a composer of the Lassie TV show. And that was where the music was written, in this space.
Wow.
Wow.
Tom used to sit and copy charts for his dad and stuff. So
Magic walls.
yeah.
That's
Cool,
amazing. You know what? Another thing I really love about this time period was Paul using that Yamaha bass. It was such a chunky sound for him. I just loved it.
That came after Back to the Egg, even though
Okay.
it's
Oh,
in the videos, but he didn't use it on the record. The record is, I think, mostly the Rickenbacker. I played a Fender jazz bass on Love Awake. I don't think Denny did any bass that ended up on the record, but like on To You, Paul was playing a Zemaitis acoustic bass guitar.
cool.
Yeah.
Picture in my book of him playing that. So I think it was, the Yamaha, when the Yamaha came along, so that would have been May, right after the album was finished. It would have been April or May of 79. And Paul used it on the tour. We didn't do the UK tour until November, December. So it was quite a long time after the album came out. But Steve Holly and I got drafted into going to New York to do the promotion for Back to the Egg. So first of all, we went around Europe. And it was just me and Steve. I mean, Paul and Linda didn't really want to go out there. They were, they said, "Oh, you're the new guys, you do it." So we did. We went around Germany and Belgium and Spain and I forget where else, and then back to London, and then we went to New York and did a whole bunch of publicity there. Got in the paper, the Daily News, and it was cool. I mean, I had no idea at that point. I did not know until I got to New York just how different the appreciation of the Beatles and Wings was in America compared with England.
Pretty
It was
rabid.
a much bigger deal.
I bet. I could just imagine. They had finished that stadium tour just a few years earlier, and they were huge.
But just even before that, the Beatles were a massive phenomenon in America. They were a phenomenon in England, but they were also homegrown, so it didn't last, it didn't have the same resonance in England that it did in America, and still does. It took a long time for, I mean, if Liverpool had been in America, they would have embraced the Beatles as a cash cow immediately.
Mm-hmm.
It took them a long time to really realize the value of what that represented to the city.
That's amazing.
So a couple more tracks I was curious about. Arrow Through Me, that's a pretty different album, or pretty different single, I should say, on the album.
Yeah.
It's all keyboard driven, right? And in the video.
There's no guitar. It's basically, it's a Fender Rhodes playing, all the bass is a Fender Rhodes. There's no bass guitar on it either.
And
There's two kits.
Clavinets mixed in there, I think. And
It might have been a clavinet, yeah. Or it might have just have been the tines on the Rhodes, I forget.
Yeah, you're playing keyboards in the video.
Yeah, well, yeah, I had to play something.
right. But really,
I think I played keyboards live too, and of course we had put the horns on as well. But that particular tune, it's really interesting. My daughter Ilse is a songwriter, a successful songwriter, happily, and she says that she walks into a lot of writing sessions where Back to the Egg is a topic of conversation in general. I mean, like she co-wrote a song, Treat People with Kindness, that's on Harry Styles' last album, which I also played on that track, coincidentally. And Harry Styles is a huge Wings fan and a huge Back to the Egg fan. But the song that everybody picks out as being really, a special song is Arrow Through Me. And there's an Erykah Badu record that takes the loops, the intro of Arrow Through Me, and creates, just uses that as the backing for an entire song.
Yeah, Joey Dosick of Wolfpack covers that song live. In fact, I last saw him do that song at the Greek Theater.
Who did you say?
The funk band Wolfpack, that's very popular right now.
It starts with a V, like in Victor.
Yeah.
Yeah, they're an unsigned band that just sold out the Madison Square Garden. Well, Joey, who's the sax player, when he does his solo shows, he does Arrow Through Me, and it's always like everyone's like, "What's this song?" But I'm like, "Oh, I know." The people that know.
The thing about Arrow Through Me is that when you strip it down, it's almost like a jazz tune, and it's very clever songwriting. That song could have been produced in a more traditionally Wings way, with the whole band playing, because it has enough meat on its bones as a song to go either way. I think it's a shame, as a single, it wasn't really the kind of tune that could have been a top 20 record. But the fact that it still resonates and wins new fans, I think, is proof that it is in there in the A-list of McCartney songs.
Yeah, nothing sounds like that in his catalog. One of the questions I had is, it must have been refreshing for him that you weren't necessarily a Wings fan, that you were that you were a Beatle fan, but you weren't like 100% aware of Jimmy and Henry and those styles, because it seems like Back to the Egg was like a complete revision of the Wings formula. So it's interesting to see how much you guys were changing things up as opposed to just taking the previous group and moving on.
Well, I think that, there's a few different factors at work with that. One is, I was not unaware of Henry and Jimmy's work, because both of them in their own way are kind of blues rock lead guitar players. But a major reason that I was invited into the band was because of my versatility, because I could cross over into different areas. Where appropriate, I could play, like on Spin It On, this kind of punky rockabilly stuff, or something more, more mainstream. But I think that the sense was, and this is why Chris Thomas was there as a co-producer, was to not do another Wings album, not do, certainly not another London Town, which was very folky, really, in general. And, each Wings album kind of, is indicative of the particular personnel. And I think that Steve brought a more English backbeat to the rhythm section. If you think about it, Paul tended to work with, Denny Seiwell, Joe English, both American drummers. Denny Seiwell being a New York jazz drummer, not a big backbeat player. And nobody really plays like Ringo. But Steve brought that kind of heavier backbeat to it. So it was a more muscular rhythm section. And we're talking about the Yamaha bass earlier. Listen on the live, the 79 tour, the Last Flight bootleg. You listen, Paul's bass is massive. That the rhythm section had really grown to being a substantial rock rhythm section. And I don't think that Paul's played that heavily since.
Now, did Paul switch to round wound strings on the Yamaha?
Yeah, he had round wound on the Yamaha.
Yeah, because that's something that as a bass player I always noticed on the, on hearing those 79 recordings, is that Paul's known to be a flat wound guy, very muddy, even with the Rickenbacker.
Just the girth in his bass notes.
Mm-hmm.
That tour, and how he and Steve really were locked with that.
Yeah.
Just it was, and having that behind me was very inspiring.
Yeah, and one of the first things I noticed about Steve was also a larger drum set too. He compared to Joe, who had like a small little 4-piece kit. He's got the concert toms. He's got the China cymbal that he uses very, very, very effectively at the end of Getting Closer. It was a real arena sound compared to the previous.
Yeah, and I think that was part of the ultimate demise of the band, was that that's not the direction that Paul was going in as a songwriter, as an artist, and that wasn't the direction they were going in as a family. They had moved the kids out of town. They'd moved down to Peasmarsh. The kids were in a local school. They didn't want to go, Linda didn't really want to do another world tour. And then you have Paul doing the McCartney 2 record, and then, teaches us coming up to do on the UK tour, which then ends up being the B-side of Paul's solo version of it, and then radio flips it over and it becomes a #1 record.
Yeah, that's really the definitive version.
What it's going to do.
Yeah.
And it really it epitomizes the fact that the band was a rock and roll band. Although the last 2 hit singles for Wings were both dance records too, in a sense. They were rock dance records. In fact, Good Night Tonight was a massive hit in the European discos all through the summer of '79. And so you have, the band really had its own kind of musical identity that had developed, but it wasn't where Paul was going as an artist. And he has, with McCartney too, he has this flirtation with electronica, which ended up being incredibly influential, but much later. It's like you talk to all the EDM people, love that album.
Regarding coming up, did he come up with that main riff?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, that's such a catchy riff, and
it's a great riff, and it doesn't change. I mean, it's like a James Bond thing. It just stays on the 1 chord, even when the rest of the band changes.
Even when that Mixolydian climbing thing in A happens, it still stays put.
It still stays put.
Well, one guitar,
because it's an E and a G sharp. So when you play the A chord, you kind of implicit in there as an A major 7th.
Right. Okay.
What about that kind of like sax big band thing?
That was Paul kind of noodling on a synth, was where that came from. But you add the horns to that, and then it becomes more like a big band thing.
Right. Yeah, that's just one of my favorites. I think that's one of the first ones that caught my ear back when it was brand new. Actually,
this, in fact, was 30. Where are we? 40 years ago now, it was #1.
Oh, yeah.
Wow.
July of 1980.
I remember that summer. I remember that summer very well. And
I remember walking down wherever it was, 48th Street or something, and hearing it coming out of a boombox and thinking, whoa.
What's the story on the fact that Back to the Egg was the first Wings album with a slew of music videos? What happened there?
I think that was because Columbia Records, I'm guessing that Columbia Records wanted to be able to promote the album on television. And it was put together as a half-hour special.
Yeah.
I think it was sponsored by Coca-Cola or somebody, but it was
that Spin It On video in the hangar.
It happened way later in the year. I don't know why it took so long to put it out, because we shot the videos like in May, and I don't think it went on the air till like November or something.
And were they long video shoots? Like the Getting Closer, there's the shots of you guys in the van, and then there's, I guess, the shots of you guys on the soundstage. Right. Was that all planned out, or
actually, it wasn't the soundstage. It was an actual aircraft hangar.
Oh, cool!
We did the Spin It On video there too, because of the reference to an aircraft hangar.
Well, it's
Yeah.
kind of it's interesting. Wings took that long to make an aircraft reference, with a name like
Yeah,
Wings.
yeah.
Can you tell us a bit more about Getting Closer and how that one came about, its genesis?
Well, it was a song that Paul had, I think, for some years, because there's a demo of him doing it from like, I think, 73 or something.
Wow.
Okay.
So that was really presented to us as a complete song, except for the ending. That whole end section got developed when we were back in London, because we did most of that song at the castle. And then when we got to, it kind of never quite got finished up until we got into the replica studio. And I distinctly remember spending a solid chunk of time playing, kind of, big rock guitar solos at the end of it. I mean, somewhere on the cutting room floor, there's, at least a dozen different solos. And I think that at some point, Paul just said, how about this? And I don't know whether it was a lick that I had played or something that he already had in his head. But what we ended up with became more of a kind of an orchestrated thing than it was really a soloistic thing. Because I don't think that Wings was ready to go into that kind of pure guitar solo mode. I mean, you think about, guitar solos on Wings records tend to be pretty concise and not going on for, 2-3 minutes, as perhaps could have been the case.
But you guys were also listening to a lot of punk at the time. I guess was being influenced by the fact that Chris had done, the Sex Pistols world, where it's all of a sudden guitar solos were passé. So it just seems like,
But I think it goes back earlier than that. I think that Paul is not. It was much later. I mean, in recent years, he kind of embraced the idea of some extended guitar solos. But at the time, and even with the Beatles, I mean, George only got 8 bars or 12 bars to do his thing. So it was necessary to really kind of compose your solos, to fit everything into a very concise space.
I get criticized for that. That's not a solo. You came up with that. I'm like, yeah, I like memorable melodic solos sometimes.
I mean, I love the fact that you can listen to the Beatles outtakes and you can hear George building the solo, knowing that they're not going to get it until take 6 or 7. So he's just, working it out so that when the final take happens, he's right there with the memorable solo.
That's beautiful. My favorite part of the end of Getting Closer is the minor second descending thing. Doge, doge, doge. Who came up with that?
That's Paul's bass line.
Okay.
Awesome.
Yeah. But live, I had a Roland, the equipment company made a rack, one of the first guitar racks that had a pitch to voltage converter in it that was like a guitar synthesizer.
Cool.
Just a monophonic guitar synthesizer. And on stage, I used that to double the riff, that stuff. I was doubling that an octave.
Sounds like Greensleeves.
What's that?
You just made it sound like Greensleeves a little bit.
Well, yeah, on an acoustic guitar, of course.
That's cool.
But also remember, Greensleeves has that major minor kind of sensibility to it. That wasn't the first time I actually used a guitar synth. I mean, I was using had the Avatar, and that's all over. Like the reception thing, that's the ARP Avatar, playing doubled with kind of a distorted lead sound. On the broadcast, that orchestra was one that we created. I mean, it was like Mellotron, and it was Paul playing a gizmotron and me playing the arp.
On that weird telly, I've seen pictures of him with the gizmotron. I have a gizmotron, and I've seen pictures of him with like a copy of a telly that seems sawed off.
A copy with a hacked out cutaway and a prototype gizmotron. Yeah, there's pictures in my book.
That's cool.
Excellent. Yeah. Okay, another question. So when it came time to go on tour, I noticed they worked in a few Beatles songs. Was there any voting on that to decide what Beatles tunes to play, or was it just Paul's choice?
We tried a few things. I mean, I don't remember having a vote. I think "Got to Get You Into My Life" was a current hit for Earth, Wind and Fire.
Right. Brilliant.
The final lick that we did, you know, when we did it, kind of like borrowed from them. Da 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 da. You know, one of those.
Right. Yeah. That's
but beyond that, I mean, I remember we did at one point. We tried things we said today, but we never really kind of went anywhere with it. So there weren't very many Beatles songs. I mean, "Let It Be" was a natural.
Sure. I think "Fool on the Hill," was that in there?
"Fool on the Hill," "Yesterday," of course. I don't know that there was any others. I mean, that Paul was still really kind of like staying away from Beatle stuff. And I know he'd done "Yet Long and Winding Road" for the, for the Wings Over America stuff. But "Let It Be," I mean, that was a special one. And I think that was one of the highlights of the show, was doing that. At least it was for me, because over the course of the whole tour, I got to build the solo, talking about kind of making memorable solos, and not referencing George's solos, because there wasn't like the one definitive "Let It Be" solo. There were the various different ones. So I just felt the freedom to be able to take it where I wanted to take it. And and the Glasgow version and then the Campeche one were kind of the last two takes of it. And then that was pretty much, I mean, I think that was it for Beatles songs. I don't remember if we did any others.
Pretty short list. So tell us about the album cover. You remember the photo session for this? What were you all staring at a coffee table or something? And then
we were staring at it. Again, it's in the book. You can see we were staring at it, kind of just a cutout thing.
Okay. I'm very curious. Well, tell us a bit about the book. I understand that Linda's photography kind of inspired you to do a bit too. Is that right?
I saw Linda taking all these pictures, and I thought, here's an opportunity that's not going to come around very often. So I got myself a decent camera and just started snapping. And then the picture sat in shoeboxes for 30 plus years. And I got offered a book deal, and then spent a year and a half just going through it and scanning and writing, and and ended up with a book.
Yeah, it's called Guitar with Wings, correct? And where's the best place to get it?
From me.
From you? Okay.
Through my website.
Through your website?
Yeah, my online store.
I'm going to order one.
You shall. Yeah, you got two new customers tonight.
You got it. Absolutely. I'd love it. And it's kind of like a coffee table book, right?
It's exactly like a coffee table book.
Excellent.
But without the legs.
Okay, that's good. All right. That's cool. Okay.
So what guitar were you playing on Back to the Egg? What was your main squeeze at the time?
In Scotland, when we started, I was, let me think, I had a black 63 Strat, which I think had Mighty Mite pickups in it. That's what's on
the back cover.
Yeah, that's on the back cover, and that's what's on Spin It On To You.
That one there.
I had a early 70s Strat with a maple fingerboard that I used on Again and Again and Again. Maisie was done on a Gibson Super 400.
Wow.
which was kind of my jazzy guitar. It's the one that's in the Baby's Request video.
Mm-hmm.
And then I got a 335, which I used on like the end of After the Ball. That's the 335. That's the guitar that's in the Good Night Tonight video.
Oh yeah.
Oh yeah.
I also had a Les Paul Custom that
Which is in the Getting Closer
that's
video.
on Old Siamsa, and that's the one in the Getting Closer video.
Yeah.
And beyond that, just various acoustics and stuff.
And when did you get the SG that you played on tour with them?
I got that while we were rehearsing for the tour. I found it in a guitar store in London, and it was, I really liked the way it sounded. The bridge pickup on that is just a really good lead sound.
Yeah. I mean, were you aware that?
Years to realize that on the fingerboard pickup, that if you turn it around, because the pole pieces are not in the right place, because it's a kind of a long neck on an SG. But if you turn the pickup around, then it puts the pole pieces in exactly the right place, and it sounds a lot better. So
cool.
That's something that I quite recently was when I made that change. But that guitar it was good. But I also had and still have that guitar, as well as a 57 Strat that is that's the one that's in the Wonderful Christmas Time video.
Mm-hmm.
That guitar was kind of like my second guitar for the tour. I didn't use it very often, but it was there. And then the Black Strat ended up getting refinished, and that was in my my quiver, as it were, for the Japanese tour, because like the SG was the wrong sound for a tune like Another Day, which we had added to the set.
Okay. And what was your amp setup like for the tour?
It was a Mesa Boogie.
Okay.
And Linda had bought one for Paul as a gift, so we had Paul's and mine next to each other on stage. And then
cool.
I also had the Roland Rack with a Dimension D, which was like, one of the all-time great chorus sounds. And that was feeding two Marshall 4x12 cabinets. So like on Let It Be, for example, I could get a kind of a big stage-wide Leslie sound through this setup. And then I could switch to the lead sound, switch between the Roland, kind of the clean solid state sound, and then the Boogie, which was more of the lead sound.
Cool.
What are some?
And then Denny had that Travis Bean guitar in a lot of those videos. Did he use that on the record as well? I
think so, yeah.
Cool.
Yeah, I mean, Denny had all kinds of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
There was a Les Paul, which I think might have been a 56 that had humbuckers added to it. It was a first. And yeah, and for amps on Back to the Egg, I mean, a lot of it was done, Spin It On was done on a Mesa Boogie. I think a Mark I Mesa Boogie. But most of that stuff was done on small Fenders, either, brown Tolex or Tweed.
Cool.
Kind of deluxe type Fenders. You don't need a lot of amp power in the studio for those kind of records.
Well, you came from a studio background. Was it kind of shocking to all of a sudden be on stage with huge volume?
I wouldn't say that our volume was that huge.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe out front it was, but on stage it wasn't. And we were fairly widely spread out, too.
Yeah.
In fact, I was, always getting asked to turn down.
Cool.
Remember, the Beatles were not necessarily a really loud band.
Mm-hmm.
Although an AC-30 can pump out a fair amount of volume.
Yeah.
Still, people just didn't play at that kind of, ear-splitting volume level.
Well, I mean, one of the things that I noticed about Jimmy McCulloch is that he played with a lot of game compared to you and Henry, which had a little bit more of a bluesier type thing. When you were preparing for the tour, did Paul ever say, check out the way Jimmy played this, or did he want you to? No, 100%.
No, it was really just do what you want to do.
Because I noticed on Maybe I'm Amazed, you threw on a phaser, which was really cool.
I'm sorry?
Yeah, I was hearing a recording of you playing Maybe I'm Amazed, and you were throwing on a phaser.
It wasn't me. They actually put a flanger on when they mixed it.
Ah.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Because I didn't, typically when I was playing lead, I didn't like to put any kind of pitch shift on it.
Oh, cool. So that's a board decision.
Yeah, that was a mixing decision.
Can you tell us a bit about Wonderful Christmas Time? You know, that's become one of the legendary Christmas tunes, and it's
Christmas tunes, yeah.
And you know, it's kind of
evergreen.
And it's kind of a love it or hate it one, is what I've discovered.
Yeah.
You know, the people that really love it, love it.
A lot of people have covered it. My big memory of that was when we would do it on stage, and we would have, you know, there was some guy came down on a rope, you know, in a Santa Claus costume, and there was this fake snow that came down, and nobody told me that this snow stuff was going to happen. And the first time, you know, I'm singing, you know, doing the angelic choir bits, and I open my mouth, and this stuff comes down, and I get a mouthful of fake snow.
That had a rather interesting solo. Was that Paul that did it?
Yeah, that's Paul.
Okay.
That's so jazzy. I love it.
Yeah.
So cool.
Very interesting.
But yeah, but you guys, that's another thing that confused me, because you guys are in the video, but not on the song.
Right. You know, and I remember doing the video. It was very chilly. You know, dancing around this big bonfire, and in this pub that was Laurence Olivier, you know, the actor Sir Laurence Olivier. That was his local pub. He wasn't there though.
That's wild. Out of the older Wings tunes that you played before you came along that were recorded, what were some of your favorites?
Well, I like doing Every Night, which of course, you know, really was McCartney, you know, McCartney as
right.
And we didn't do, you know, Listen to What the Man Said. We didn't do silly love songs.
Yeah.
But Every Night, and of course, Maybe I'm Amazed.
Sure.
That stuff, I mean, that was special because I was really had been more of a fan of that than the kind of the later Wing stuff, you know, which tended more in the pop direction. The thing that I loved about the Wings records were the backing vocals.
Oh yeah.
The way in which, and that was always fascinating, just to sit in the studio and listen to Paul, Linda, and Denny stack vocals.
Yeah.
And how that sound was such a characteristic sound of 70s pop records, whether it was the Bee Gees or the Carpenters or Wings. There were just certain records that had this very rich, right in your face.
Yeah.
Did you guys use an Eventide harmonizer on the vocals at all?
No, they didn't use a harmonizer on the vocals. What they did do was the Dolby, they'd record with the Dolbys in and then play back with the Dolbys out. Because what Dolby did, and this is, you know, going back now to tape, the Dolby system was a noise reduction system, and it used a way of, when you recorded with the Dolbys, it would kind of emphasize certain frequencies, and then on the playback it would cut those frequencies, and somehow it managed to reduce the amount of tape hits. Well, if you put the Dolbys in when you recorded but didn't unencode them, so if you didn't put them in on playback, you would get this kind of a bit of a wash in the sound. Now, there was also the Aphex Oral Exciter, which was a brand new piece of gear that supposedly we used on Goodnight Tonight, although my recollection is they could never really figure out how to make it really work. But that was another thing that would do something similar. It would add a little bit of kind of high-end energy there was kind of ear candy.
Yeah, that's one of the coolest things about, you know, the curve of technology from when the Beatles started working all the way throughout the 80s, where it's like you guys were working as all this new equipment was starting to be brought in, and you guys were just experimenting. That's the beautiful thing about being a producer and being an engineer back when all this gear was brand new, and learning it, I guess using it wrong was a fun way to do it. So the Dolby idea, I guess that must have been a mistake. You must have accidentally left it off and said, wow, this sounds great.
I just don't know. I mean, there are engineering tricks that happen for whatever reason they happen. And you just don't know. Sometimes you don't know with some of the stuff unless you invent it.
Yeah. Was Back to the Egg 48 track or 24?
It was all 24 except Rockestra was 48.
Which is a big subject we're about.
That's a good segue. A good segue. If
yeah.
How did that all come about? And was the song written in advance, knowing that all these stars would come play it later?
Paul had written this tune that he thought would be fun to do a rock orchestra, and he said, "Let's do it." And so they made the calls, and they got John Bonham and Kenny Jones. It would have been Keith Moon, but he died a month earlier.
Okay.
And Dave Gilmour and Pete Townsend and Hank Marvin and John Paul Jones. And I mean, it was a long list.
And this was in studio 2 or 1?
2.
2. Wow. Wow, it must have been a packed room. How loud was it?
It was pretty packed. Yeah, I mean, it was pretty exciting. But, you can't be that loud if you well, I mean, I say John Bonham was in the, I mean, sounded like somebody was driving. He sat down at the drums and it sounded like somebody drove a truck through the studio. I mean, it was
amazing
a lot of noise. But the fact is that, I mean, it was, of course you're wearing headphones too. So, I really not quite sure how loud it truly was in the room. But, when you've got that many musicians playing, you want a certain amount of bleed just to get the blend, but you don't want so much that you can't control a proper balance.
How much did you geek out being in the same guitar line with all these legends?
Oh, totally. Especially Hank Marvin was standing next to me, and he was my
amazing
first hero. Yeah.
I mean, yeah, that's the guy. I mean, it's incredible how much Hank Marvin inspired so many guitar players in England, and yet people in America don't know who he is. It's amazing. It's an incredible thing.
Because Cliff Richard never had the career in the States that he had everywhere else.
Yeah. Very interesting.
Yeah.
And of course, in America, you had the Ventures.
Yes.
Yeah, so it's kind of similar vibe.
Yeah, and when
American.
there's only so many guitar players that you can fit on the head of a pin, as it were.
It's also interesting to see how many red Strats popped up. Everyone seemed to have one because of Hank. So,
Well, and that was one that Cliff Richard had brought over from America because you couldn't buy a Strat in England. There was an import ban. So Strats were not available, and then Cliff brought one over and gave it to Hank.
Yeah. Yeah, I always read about Harrison always wanted a Strat, and that's why he had that weird Futurama guitar in Germany.
Eventually gets a Sonic Blue 1961 Stratocaster along with John.
Yeah. Which ended up being Rocky, which is a cool guitar.
So I have a sorry.
Go for it.
About the Rockestra, I noticed some footage of like a lot of those guys playing on a MDA telethon or something. Did you do some live performances with some of those players? Or
we did the Campuchia concert.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe that's what I saw. Okay.
With the matching suit.
Yeah, exactly.
That was the time we did anything like that. Campuchia was a series of concerts that Paul and Harvey Goldsmith put on in association with UNICEF to aid Cambodian refugees. And there were 3 nights, the Who headlined, Queen headlined, and Wings headlined at the Hammersmith Odeon. So it was like, it wasn't an arena thing, it was a theater thing. And there were various acts, like the night we played was Elvis Costello and Rockpile.
Wow.
and then I forget, Pretenders and Ian Jury and the Blockheads, and I forget who else did it, but it was, it was new, the new acts and the old guard, it was almost like a changing of the guard from the 70s into the 80s. And so, Wings did a shortened set, and then we did Rockestra. We did a set with Rockestra we did Lucille, we did the Rockestra theme, and we did Let It Be.
I have a crazy question.
It was released as a single by Atlantic.
Oh, cool. When in the performance from Kampuchea, there's a rumor that Paul's original Hofner bass is being played by Ian Hunter. Is that true?
In Kampuchea?
Yeah, there's. I was following those videos, and there's lots of interesting
speculation. Ian Hunter being there, but he could have been.
Oh no, sorry, must have been
John Paul Jones, maybe. Or maybe. Robert Plant. Maybe Robert Plant.
Oh, Robert Plant. That's right, Robert Plant. Robert Plant miming basically on a left-handed Hofner.
Yeah, it was just it was rock and roll.
And what's the story on Pete Townsend not wanting to wear the suit?
I think he'd had a few Remy Martin.
Feeling a little feisty.
Yeah, he just didn't want to get in on that. I think he thought it was probably a little bit too McCartney, and wanted to maintain his own rock star space, which is why I put the top hat on him at the end, and then he throws it out to the audience.
Now, you weren't much of a partier, were you?
I'm sorry?
Were you a partier?
No.
Because unfortunately, everybody knows about how Jimmy, was unfortunately he was a victim of the drugs and the scene. So you're still around. So I guess you're and your seriousness towards your art definitely helped you stay around, because so many people in Rockestra are not around anymore because of drugs and all that stuff.
Yeah,
so.
I mean, for me, it was just, it was my career. And to be a professional means being professional. And I never really had that much of a taste for alcohol or, the heavier stuff.
Was marijuana kind of a staple around?
Yeah, but you're talking like 70s when the THC level was a fraction of what it is.
Yeah, pretty swaggy.
The THC level was much higher. So this was not the kind of stuff that you would get, completely whacked out on. I mean, it was fairly low level. Because, I mean, you couldn't, if it was anything like today's stuff, you couldn't work.
Right, you'd be in a coma.
Well, that just makes it even sadder that pot ended up being a big part of the demise of Wings, with the Japan.
It was part of it to the extent that it made touring uncomfortable. And it just added to Linda's discomfort, because she had 4 kids, and I think, having James and being in the band it was getting to be too much. And I think that it was just, that Japanese bus didn't help.
Right. I can't imagine the disappointment, Laurence, because, I've kind of looked into all the history of how, the original Beatle busts had kept Wings out of Japan during the Wings Over America tour, and Japan was it was last minute cancellation after last minute cancellation. Was it a complete shock to you?
It was a disappointment.
Mm-hmm.
Not necessarily a shock, because you learn that things don't always turn out the way you expect them to. You know how the entertainment business is in general. But I was standing next to him when the customs guy opened the suitcase and starts patting around and lifts up a jacket, and there's an ounce of weed in there. That was not a fun moment. by any means. And it was, it was a shock in terms of it kind of, you're heading in this direction and then you're going in that direction. But it was, you chalk it up to experience.
Were you guys sent home immediately, or did you stick around?
Spent a few days in Tokyo. Then I flew to LA, and Steve went to Australia.
Wow.
We had first class tickets to go, from Tokyo to London, so you could kind of reroute. So I spent a little time in LA and saw my first Super Bowl.
Nice.
Nice.
Okay.
From there, went back to London, and then, once Paul got out of jail, I mean, he was in the studio within a few days, mixing stuff from the Glasgow show.
Wow.
And then, hadn't been there very long when there's a little box arrives in the mail, and I open it up, and there's this thing inside it that you had to screw together, and it took me a while to realize it was a Grammy. And that we had won a Grammy for Rockestra, and nobody had told us. Everybody was so distracted by,
That must have been very expensive for the Grammys to have to make, 65 statues for everyone.
Yeah, I have no idea how that went down. But generally, if you're not in the featured band, like writers, you get a certificate, you don't necessarily get the trophy. So yeah, I mean, and then then it was really kind of, Wings was kind of like, just there was activity, but there was intermittent activity, but we were still functionally a band, and there was still stuff going on right through until January of '81. But, it was already starting to become obvious that, because Tug of War was going to be a McCartney album, not a Wings album. And when we had been rehearsing that material, we were in a rehearsal room. We weren't in a recording studio. It was difficult because we couldn't craft a record that way. When you're in a rehearsal room, you're rehearsing in a more like a live rock band, and of course this is material that wasn't rock band material, with the exception of certain songs that didn't necessarily make the cut for Tug of War. I mean, like, I remember No Values, for example, which up in Broad Street, I thought was a fabulous song. Paul said he dreamt a Rolling Stones song, but then he changed it when he did it in Broad Street. It wasn't as raw as it had felt when we first heard it.
I always thought that the solo in Dress Me Up Like a Robber sounded like Paul channeling you and on Good Night Tonight.
It's possible.
Was Take It Away part of the songs you were working on for Tug before it?
I don't recall that.
Okay, yeah. I think it's such a great song. I think it's one of his best
Yeah,
80s tunes.
Dancing and that stuff. I mean, it was... but it was, and there's, I have somewhere in a box, I have cassettes of all those rehearsals. But at some point, it just, especially once George Martin got involved, and it was, no longer a Wings thing. But we regrouped in January of '81 and worked on Cold Cut stuff. But I'd already decided I was moving to New York at that point. So... and it was funny because the day that I left, I went to visit them at Air Studios. And while I was there, I got a phone call from Tony Visconti asking me if I would play on a Mary Hopkin record, because he was still married to her at the time. And I couldn't. I was on my way to New York. Not long after I joined the band, over Christmas of '78, Tony had asked me to go to Switzerland to do a record with Rick Wakeman.
Very nice.
And I thought, well, this is kind of cool. And Paul said, it's okay, you can go. But then the next day he changed his mind and said, we're really a band. I don't really want you doing session work because that just takes away from the band.
Interesting.
So on two occasions, I got cool projects with Tony that I couldn't do. But,
Denny Sywell was telling me a similar story on how he had been working with Billy Joel when he got a call from Paul saying, "Are you in the band or not?
right.
Get over here."
Yeah. But not just playing drum. I mean, he was producing. I think he was producing
Yeah,
Billy Joel. Yeah.
that's what he told me. He missed out on producing Cold Spring Harbor to go play with Wings, but again, that's what do they call that? Definitely a win-win situation. Or spoils of victory, lots of things. That's great.
Slight upgrade.
Yeah. So it's interesting you mentioned the instrumental Grammy. You've really developed an incredible reputation as an instrumental guitar player. And I put out instrumental albums, and it's a real shame that instrumental Grammy is no longer the instrumental rock Grammy.
Rock instrumental is gone. Pop instrumental was really kind of created for Dave Koz. It was really intended for the kind of the smooth jazz crowd.
Mm-hmm.
And it was, so it was kind of a shock when we got it for the Henry Mancini Pink Guitar album that my arrangement of Pink Panther is on. That was a little bit left field for that category, but that category doesn't even exist now. Thank you for reminding me. I've got to put in my Grammy submissions.
Yes, don't we all?
Yeah.
Cool. Another quick question for you. So after Wings dissolved, you went back.
Wings folded.
Folded. Yes, so those wings just folded up. You got back into session work in LA, and
it wasn't instant. I actually got into session work in New York.
Okay.
Because I was living in New York, but then I met Hope in New York, and she was from LA, and so we had this kind of transcontinental relationship all through the summer of '81, and then I moved out to LA in October, and by the following spring, I'd pretty much kind of started getting into the studio scene.
Okay. Well, and I know some of the notable records you worked on. Belinda Carlisle, for example. Mad About You. Yeah, how did that come about?
Through Michael Lloyd. Michael's kind of a old school Hollywood record producer. Going back to when he was a teenager and producing records. He and Mike produced You Light Up My Life for Debbie Boone, which was a huge hit.
Oh, yeah.
He did like David Cassidy, for example. He did a lot of pop stuff. And I had been introduced to him and started doing session work for him, and still do on occasion. Done many, many records, including the soundtrack to Dirty Dancing we did.
Yeah, that was a biggie.
I'm on like Time of My Life and She's Like the Wind. And the Mary Clayton single, Yes, which was actually one of the cool songs, but didn't have the same success as a single that the others did. And that was, Michael has a studio in Beverly Hills, and I've done sessions for him. I've done arrangements for him. I've done a lot of projects there. In fact, the last big project we did was for Sylvie Vartan, who is a big French pop star that used to be married to Johnny Hallyday. You know your Beatles in France history, that the Beatles opened for Johnny Hallyday.
Wow.
And we did an album with her of Johnny Hallyday songs that I think was a huge hit, went to #1 in France. Fairly recently, a couple of years ago. But a lot of the studio work that I ended up doing in LA was for television and movies too. Home Improvement, Roseanne, Seventh Heaven.
Cool.
Movies like Good Will Hunting.
And were you still primarily electric guitar player?
No, playing a lot of acoustic too.
Mm-hmm.
I really started developing the acoustic thing during the 80s, and I put out my first solo acoustic album in 1990.
Cool.
And I've done, I think, 30.
Yeah, I noticed there's quite a list.
Along the way, I ended up producing 4 albums for Al Stewart and playing, arranging, all that stuff.
Didn't you work with Barry Manilow also?
Yeah, on a few projects. We did one, a concept album of his called 15 Minutes. But
Really?
again, Michael Lloyd produces Barry, so.
Just the thought of Barry doing a concept album is rather intriguing.
Yeah, it was quite interesting. He built a Las Vegas show around it, I think.
Wow. Okay. Well, that's thinking
So
big.
cool.
Yeah, very much so. So the Dadgad tuning, how did you happen across that, and what inspired you to follow it?
I never really was much into alter tunings early on, a little bit, but I didn't go that deeply into the kind of the Davy Graham school of English folk guitar, because I was kind of drawn more to like the Stefan Grossman kind of ragtime stuff, as well as classical and Renaissance lute music and things. And I had done two albums, two acoustic albums, and there were a few people who were saying, you really should try some alter tunings because you're very comfortable in standard tuning. And maybe you need to, kind of like expand a bit. And so the first place I expanded to was Dadgad, and it was something of a revelation. I was in a hotel room in Portland, Oregon, doing some kind of tour, and it was pouring with rain, and I just got stuck in the hotel room, and I thought, okay, let's try this Dadgad thing, and I ended up writing a tune called Bob's Your Uncle, and that then led to a series of compositions that use that tuning, and it became kind of something of a staple for me because it allows me to use my musical understanding in ways that don't fit neatly into the kind of the regular guitar boxes. There's more, I can do more, almost play more pianistically, in terms of chord voicings and bass lines and then I discovered that, there's just certain pop tunes just work really well in Dadgad. I mean, whether it's, something like Strawberry Fields Forever, which didn't make a lot of sense in standard tuning, works great in Dadgad.
Cool.
And then, I kind of went beyond that to other alter tuning.
Were you aware of some of the Dadgad songs from the 70s, like Kashmir?
Not until later.
Okay,
I mean,
yeah.
I was, but Zeppelin was funny because I was a huge Zeppelin fan for the first two albums. And then I kind of lost track. It's like same thing with Pink Floyd. It was like Atom Heart Mother. And then I just I was busy listening to Mahavishnu Orchestra and Return Forever. And
Now you're talking. Yeah,
There we go.
Yeah, actually, Fernando and I are big progressive rock and fusion fans also. And I was curious your thoughts on some of those groups. And if you ever had the pleasure of seeing any of them.
For me, it was like, Soft Machine.
Oh, yeah.
But like no guitar Soft Machine. I mean, before Alan Holdsworth.
Like number 3-ish, yeah, earlier kind of.
Way early. I mean,
very
early on.
Number 2 is a wonderful album, too. It's such a unique and zany record.
And, we had these kind of, Hatfield and the North and those kind
Love
of.
it. But
for me, I was playing a lot of that stuff. I mean, playing with the National Youth Jazz Orchestra, there was a lot of fusion-y stuff built into that. So my frame of reference was, I was Miles Davis, the kind of the mid-70s era Miles Davis, early to mid-70s. I mean, post Bitches Brew stuff.
Right.
And McLaughlin and Al Di Meola, but Weather Report. I mean, Jocko was just outstanding.
Oh,
and did you get to see any of these people when they came to London? Were you a concert guy, or were you just too busy?
I would go to the concerts, but I was not a kind of a hang guy. The ones that I would hang out at was at Ronnie Scott's club, where I go see Joe Pass or Barney Castle.
Oh, wow. That's amazing in itself.
That was, like close up because it was a little club. And I'd get there at 9:30 with my student union card and get in for £2. And I'd sit there with a pack of Marlboros and a half carafe of wine until 3 o'clock in the morning and then go home and practice. So.
Oh, I'm sure that was incredibly inspiring.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, wow. I can just imagine. Any thoughts on the typical Genesis, Yes, ELP kind of stuff?
Well, yes, I was a big fan up till Tales of Topographic.
A lot of people say that. It's like, all right, this is where I get off.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
And Yeah, but I saw them. I mean, the Cream farewell concert when they opened. You know,
Wow.
With Peter Banks.
opening
Yeah.
act with Peter Banks, and their finale was "Something's Coming" from West Side Story. I
Da
mean,
da da
this
da da
was,
da.
this was very early in the yes, but I saw them a bunch of times. Um, the Rainbow in Finsbury Park um, was, I think, where they would typically play, um, and but then it just, it kind of, I just, it got away from me, and you know, I didn't keep up with it. King Crimson, very early on. Um, I think that I was always just too busy playing and too busy making a living to be too much of um, a fan in that respect, a follower type
Yeah.
fan.
I just think it's amazing that you saw that Cream show with, yes, I remember Bill Bruford talking about how he dropped his stick right in the middle of it, and just like the most embarrassing thing to have happen under so much
At the Albert Hall.
stress. Yeah.
But the coolest thing, of course, was Rory Gallagher. Taste was
Oh, wow.
he was fabulous. But the same. I mean, I sat in the same seat because a friend of mine his aunt had season tickets, and she would never go to the rock concert.
Sure.
I sat in the same seat to see Hendrix twice in
Wow.
1968, in February of '68, in the course twice in a week, and Frank Zappa.
Oh, love Frank.
So there was that kind of aspect to my musical sensibility. But when I was at London University studying music, I was going to some fairly avant-garde stuff. Whether it was Stockhausen or Peter Maxwell Davis or people like that, who were writing stuff that was quite atonal and out there. The stuff that Paul was listening to in kind of 1966,
Amazing.
Yeah, well, he did those Fireman albums, which
Well, yeah.
kind of showed a different
That's
side of him.
I think the stuff that he kind of dashes off sometimes is more interesting than the polished stuff.
What do you think of his current band? Have you had a chance to see them?
Oh yeah, a number of times, and
Yeah.
in very intimate situations. I mean, Amoeba, it was that was a very, very cool place to see Paul. Although I subsequently saw him at the Hollywood Palladium at a benefit concert where there were maybe 500 people there, and it was tables. I mean, you could literally walk up to the stage. And that was one of the few occasions where going backstage, it wasn't the receiving line, it was just Paul and Nancy.
Wow.
If you got a call from Paul to come play on something, would you drop everything and go?
As long as I didn't have to fly
Right.
right now. Yeah, I mean, I'd happily play with Paul again. And as it happens, because I no longer have a touring schedule because of COVID-19, such a thought is actually realistic as opposed to as it would have been even up until March of this year, where it's like, well, sorry, but I've got a gig in Arkansas followed by one in Aspen or wherever.
Well, there's been some interesting reunions that have happened via Zoom. This week, Sean and I and anybody who's a fan of Gentle Giant is all shocked that all the surviving members of Gentle Giant got together for a fan video involving a new version of one of their songs. What about all the Wings guys? What about you and Denny and Denny?
I don't see it happening easily. I mean, you have to do everything separately. You can't play together.
Yes.
Which makes it for a logistic thing. Now, there are certain things you can do with Zoom, like my daughter Nico, my eldest daughter, who's not the professional songwriter, but she's a writer and she's written a musical, and she did a Zoom reading yesterday with a bunch of performers out of New York.
That's cool.
And it went really well, and it's a great show. You can do stuff like that remotely, but the stuff that happens when you play together. I mean, when I play with Denny and with Steve Holley, it's like no time has elapsed since Wings.
I can imagine. I actually saw Denny a few years ago with Steve. he had a group backing him up called the Criers,
Yeah, I know the Cries.
which did a wonderful job. How often do you do Wings-related alumni kind of things?
Well, Steve and I were supposed to be doing Beatle Week in Liverpool next month, but that, of course, that got pushed back. We've done it. I call it the Wingmen, where it's me, Steve, and Denny, and then we'll have somebody somebody playing bass, whoever's like Glenn Burtnick maybe.
He's great.
Yeah, Glenn's great, and he knows all the tunes, and it's like you don't have to rehearse; you just do a
And
sound.
he's a lefty too.
And it's
But he plays upside down.
Kind of like Lee Pomeroy.
Yeah, exactly. That's the type of stuff that I just don't understand. It just throws you completely out of whack.
well, I mean, all a right-handed guitar, he'll turn it around and play it upside down.
Yeah, I think a lot of lefties did that in the early days because the left-handed ones were really hard to find and kind of expensive,
But in any case, doing a Wings thing, I mean, it's fun. I mean, I've had Denny over here. I produced a demo for him for a song where, we had a meeting and it was like, on his way out, I said, "Oh, you got any tunes?" And he said, "I got this one." And I said, "Well, play it." And, we ended up doing a nice track together. But in reality, I think that, unless we can actually get together in one place, it doesn't make a lot of sense to do that thing. For
What
me,
was it like being a guitar? Sorry,
is on just doing my solo Facebook things right now.
What was it like being a guitar team with Denny Lane?
Oh, it was great fun. I mean, Denny's a fine player. He has his right hand. He has a little bit of a folk picker's sensibility. He uses a thumb pick a lot, and he's just got this rock and roll thing about him. So it's fun.
Were you a Moody's fan back when he was in front of you? Okay.
I used to watch him on TV.
Wow. Yeah. That was amazing.
So what led to making acoustic solo records? What were the influences that led you to say, wow, I could make an acoustic solo record, and now you've made 30, What led you in that direction?
I had been doing it for some time and doing, the odd gig. And then a friend of mine, James Lee Stanley, offered me a record deal in 1990 because he had a small record label. And I put out my Solo Flight record and it got radio airplay. And people said, "Oh, do another one." So I just kind of did another one, which was Naked Guitar. And then in between Naked Guitar and the next one, LJ, was when I got into altered tunings. And then I found somebody that would actually, put some energy into promoting this stuff, because it was already kind of the tail end of the Windham Hill era. And what I was doing wasn't quite so smooth as that. And it was just a natural path for me to take because I just kept writing. And then I got to a point where my wife Hope had been, would listen to me all the time, and she'd started making suggestions and ended up becoming my co-producer. And when it came to my arrangements of Beatles records, my actual producer.
Wow.
And I've done 4 albums of Beatle tunes.
But were you aware of like the whole Michael Hedges,
yeah.
Leo Kottke world?
Not so much Leo Kottke until somewhat later. I never really listened to Leo. As I said earlier, my inspirations were the English folk Baroque players like Bert Jansch and John Remborn, and the American ragtime players. And then, then having the example of Alex DeGrassi, for example, who's a great guitar player, and those kinds of Windham Hill records was kind of, okay, well, there's a scene here, so maybe I, and then, my kind of introduction to it coincided with Fingerstyle Guitar Magazine starting up, Acoustic Guitar Magazine. There was a scene, and I kind of fit into it and just kept doing it. And I got associated with a few different guitar companies, first of all Taylor, and then Collings, and then finally Martin with a signature model. And that pretty much was, 25 plus years of, actually nearly 30 years really now of just following that path. and building a following and doing concerts and, you know, keeping my agent fed.
Do you play nylon string much, or is it mostly steel string?
More frequently now. I have a really nice nylon string.
How about 12 string?
12 string on occasion. I mean, behind me, there's a 12 string and a nylon string and an arch top, and 12 string. Yeah, I mean, the last big project that I used 12 string for was the video game Diablo 3, which I was co-composer on. And you know, these are all tools of the trade. I mean, but my self-expression is playing 6-string, steel string.
Yeah, I first met you at the Newport Guitar Festival in Miami, where I performed this for the Muriel Anderson Guitar Night thing.
Guitar night, yeah.
And
I always remember that night because Phil Keggy and I were standing next to each other, and at one point when we were all jamming, he and I played the same riff in harmony without reference to each other.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
But yeah, I remember the green room conversations were pretty epic, and it was wonderful. It was really cool, and you know, there's a lot of interesting variety in the solo guitar world, and I love the musicality of what you do, because there's a lot of guys, especially on YouTube, when they're playing solo guitar, that seem to be doing a little too much sometimes. They're playing drums, they're doing hammer-ons, they're doing double tapping. What you do is a very beautiful, elegant, and musical thing, and I love it.
Well, thank you.
I do too.
I've been working recently with a woman named Christy Linnae, who...
Oh yeah, I've seen her play.
Yeah, and she and I put out a single together a couple of months ago, called Calling in the Love, because she was staying with us, and we just got together in my studio for an hour and just kind of like jammed out a tune, and it turned out really nice, and we put it out. But she's in North Carolina and I'm in LA, so, you know, but occasionally she'll send me something and I'll, you know, make some kind of arranging or production suggestions. But she's very good and very musical. And there are, you know, plenty of players out there, you know, that can be actually surprisingly adept, not only as players, but also in terms of their showmanship. I did a Christmas show a couple of years ago with Trace Bundy, who I had thought of as being kind of like the capo guy, you know, like 3 capos and then he's moving them around all the time. And you know, which I thought was kind of interesting, but when I got to work with him, I realized that he was actually very musical and a good showman too. So, you know, you know, there are people out there, I mean, like Tommy Emmanuel, of course, is, you know, kind of rules the roost when it comes to finger picking on the global scale. And, you know, he's got this kind of encyclopedic knowledge of guitar styles. And there are certain players that, you know, and he being, you know, one that, you know, being on stage with him is an interesting challenge, because you really have to kind of, rise to that level of showmanship to match him.
I can imagine.
That's awesome. Are you discovering new guitar players on YouTube like many people are?
I'm discovering old guitar players on YouTube. My friend Perry Botkin Jr., who's now quite, you know, he's 87, I think, is not a guitar player. He's a composer and a producer. He signed Harry Nilsson to his first publishing deal, for example. But Perry's dad, Perry Botkin Sr., was really the kind of the link between the New York session guitar scene in the 30s and the LA scene. And he ended up becoming Bing Crosby's musical director for 17 years. And was a remarkable guitar player. And I'm just kind of learning about his thing. And, you know, that's the thing, is you can get kind of, you know, get lost down the YouTube wormhole where one thing leads to another. I mean, I had long forgotten about René Thomas, who's a Belgian guitar player that recorded with Stan Getz, who had this very interesting kind of bebop style. And you know, I find stuff, and all of that's kind of inspirational, you know, to the point where it's like, what can I take from this? What can I, steal in the McCartney and, the Beatles sense of kind of purloining good ideas and then turning them into their own? Or what can I use as an inspiration? And one of the key players I've been listening to recently is Oscar Alleman, who's the other Django Reinhardt.
Cool.
And he was Josephine Baker's musical director, and a lot of the time played a resonator guitar, played a dobro. Because this, of course, in the 30s was the era before electric acoustic guitar.
Mm-hmm.
You had electric Hawaiian guitars, but the regular six string was way behind the curve in that period. It wasn't until the late 30s that you got, Charlie Christian and people that would put, with Gibsons that had Charlie Christian pickups on.
That's cool.
And
well, it's great that you're continuing the artistry of the guitar as a.
But also, I've got back in time too. I mean, I put out a folio with Hal Leonard last year called "The Evolution of Fingerstyle Guitar," which I went back to 1507 to the first lute tablature that was published, and pulled some music out of that, and then went through Renaissance guitar and Elizabethan lute music and Baroque guitar, and through to the early 20th century, with stuff that basically we would consider to be classical, but really it was just fingerstyle guitar in its own era. So I have kind of like gone in that guitarology direction as well. But for me, there's still nothing like just strapping on an electric guitar and wailing. And
which is, I mean, there's a lot of guys that I've never seen play electric in that scene. So it's always great to see you play electric. I last saw you play electric for that big show that was for the Tribe, where you played with, David Crosby was there and all that stuff over at the Ace Hotel. And
with Jesse Colin Young.
Yes, and you had a beautiful tone with that big Gibson.
Oh, the big Gibson. Yeah, the ES-275.
Yeah, that's right. You backed up my friend Stephen Kalinich, and it sounded great.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, Stephen and I do a thing.
He always loves it when he always asks whoever's on stage. Yeah, let's jam. It's really cool, actually. It's he kind of invented that style, but it's free jazz almost.
Yeah, I mean, we've done things where it's been pure improv, but the gig that I've been doing, which of course we now can't, but my old friend Richard T. Bear has a band, Route 66, with Denny Sywell playing drums.
Yeah.
And the horn section from the Conan show. I mean,
oh, cool.
Nice. Killer band. It's like an 11-piece band.
Yeah, you guys were playing at the Write-Off Room.
We were playing regularly at the Write-Off Room, and that was such a fun thing. I miss that. I don't miss schlepping my Fender Pro Reverb, however. But I do miss the playing electric guitar bit. Yeah. All right. I think I'm starting to run out of steam here. So.
Thank you.
I think it's about time to wrap it up. But Laurence, thank you so much for taking the time to chat with us today. It's been fascinating. And
what's next for you?
Yes.
Well, Hope and I are finishing up the set of demos for the Brady Bunch musical, so we're anticipating that that'll get some kind of developmental production, which will lead to a tour next year. I am the arranger for a musical that's all Dan Fogelberg songs called Part of
Neat.
Debuted in Nashville a couple of years ago at the Tennessee Performing Arts Center, and that's an interesting project. And then I just recently put out my 4th album of Beatles, the Fab Fourth. I don't know that I would do another album of all Beatles, but I said that last time and the time before that. So, that's kind of where Hope really cracks the whip on that one. But I do have a whole batch of arrangements of tunes, some of which I've been working out in my Facebook Live sessions. And I would like to record another album, even if it's just a digital release. Not a lot of reason to do CDs if there's no touring, because mostly CDs are for show merchandise.
Good point. Excellent. Well, let me tell everybody what's coming up next. Next weekend, my guest is Vaylor Trucks, who will be discussing the Allman Brothers from the inside. His father was the drummer. Vaylor's father, Butch, was the drummer for the Allman Brothers. So we will be discussing that. And the following week, a band that Fernando is in, the Dave Kersner Group, will be joining us, along with Fernando and the McBroom sisters, who sang back up with Pink Floyd back in the 80s and 90s, and they're part of Dave's band now. So those are my two shows coming up. And next week I have a couple half-hour interviews with Rick Wakeman and one with Steve Hackett. So keep an eye out for those. I can't
Young whippersnappers.
All right.
Getting into the world.
I tell you.
You can find me on my artist page on Facebook at 1:30 Pacific time on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday.
I've tuned in and it's wonderful. So folks, check it out.
And Hope has a project that we did a few years ago called The Nasty Housewives that is all kind of political protest songs. Mm-hmm. But if you go to thenastyhousewives.com, but make sure you put the in, otherwise you'll get porn. And the whole album is in video form with that. And then, I don't know what the future holds in terms of gigging, so we shall see. But meanwhile, Facebook right now is where I hang my shingle, as it were.
Well, the world definitely needs beautiful music these days. So thank you so much for providing it.
My pleasure.
Yeah, thank you so much, Laurence.
Talk to you and stay well.
All righty, everyone, take care. We'll see you next week. Thanks, Fernando. Take care.
Thanks, Sean.
I'll see you soon.